Introductions. My name's Jessica Bellis. I lead our senior and executive search business for HR for the private sector in London. So really, just to start this off, day in, day out, is that as HR specialist recruiters, we have many queries from our customers, whether it be what are other people doing with their HR strategies, whether it be the labour market, or very frequently spoken about this year is employment law, update on legislations and law changes, which we know that 2025 is really the Labour government are trying to change a lot of things, which has affected our day-to-day jobs. So I think it's only May of this year, and really as HR professionals, strap up because there's going to be a lot of changes and bumps that come along the way. So today we're going to be going through new law legislations. We've also seen a change of the national insurance, but then also within the legislation is right to switch off. So we'll be discussing some of that. But if you ever want to speak about antidotes or what other firms are doing, just to give one example, is that Mercedes in Germany, they've been operating on right to switch off for many years, and it's part of their day-to-day culture. And countries such as France that have been pioneering this, putting it into law since 2016. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce Adam and Anna from Travers Smith. Today they'll be discussing the advice that they give their clients and that they provide companies across the UK. After they finish and talk through the legislation and law changes, we then will go on to a Q&A session. So if you all look within the Zoom link, you'll see a Q&A box. Just during this, please put in anything, whether it be thoughts or what you're seeing, or Q&As, whether you need a little bit of advice. So pop that in during the presentation. But I'd like to hand over to Adam and Anna. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jess, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining today. Well, as Jess said, over the next sort of 40 minutes or so, we're going to take you through some key developments and trends in employment law. And we've called this session Modern Workplaces in 2025 and Beyond, because we wanted to sort of take stock of where we are in terms of recent employment law trends, and then look at how employment law might evolve in the coming years, particularly under the Labour government. So what we're planning to cover is we'll start with workplace culture, harassment and investigations, which is a really big area of focus for lots of employers at the moment. We'll then look at some recent developments in diversity, and in particular, freedom of speech in the workplace and clash of rights, which is an issue that we're seeing crop up more and more. And next we'll come on to the expansion of worker rights, particularly looking here at the Labour government reforms. And then we'll finish up with some more family-friendly developments, so flexible working and hybrid working, as well as increased support for working parents and carers. So as Jess said, we'll aim to leave some time for questions at the end, so do submit those via the Q&A function throughout. But I'll hand over to Anna to start us off with workplace culture.
Thanks, Adam. So we've got a few topics under the heading of workplace culture and harassment, because there's a lot going on in this area. And we're going to start off with the duty to prevent sexual harassment, which, as you'll all know, is a new duty which came into force on the 26th of October last year. And the duty is on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent workplace sexual harassment. Applies to all employers in all industries. Now, we have been spending a lot of time, sort of end of last year, beginning of this year, and still to date, working with employers to make sure they're ready for the duty. But some employers are still implementing their measures. So if that's you, don't worry, you're definitely not alone. Lots of people are still working their way through all of this. So what happens if you fail to comply with the new duty? There are two main consequences. First, if an employee brings a successful sexual harassment claim and they get compensation, then that compensation could be uplifted by up to 25% for a breach of the duty to prevent. And second, even if there hasn't been a claim, the Equality and Human Rights Commission can itself step in and take enforcement action if it thinks that you're not doing enough. We saw a little bit of what that might look like in the last couple of years, because we've seen the EHRC take enforcement action against the likes of McDonald's and IKEA for not doing enough on sexual harassment. And those employers ended up giving undertakings to EHRC to update their policies and practices and to improve their training for staff on sexual harassment. And that's the sort of thing we can expect to see from the EHRC in light of the new duty. The EHRC has also published guidance, that's in the form of an update to its technical guidance, which it already had in place, and also a sort of slightly handier to use 8-step guide to preventing sexual harassment, which Adam will come on to look at a bit more in a moment. But just before that, a look to the future. And the Labour government changes that Jess was talking about. So the government's planning to change this duty that we only just have had since October from a duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment to a duty to take all reasonable steps. So query whether that's a significant change. It could arguably mean employers have to go further than now, but they do plan to set out in regulations what steps employers should take. So we will eventually see more detail on that, and there might be a slightly higher bar to meet, because at the moment we just have the guidance from EHRC, which is not binding, but it does contain a lot of detail. So I think Adam's going to take us through some of that detail now.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. In terms of what you need to be thinking about to comply with the duty, I think first and foremost, it's the risk assessment. So the guidance really says that you can't comply with the duty without doing a risk assessment. And what that means is you need to look at the risks of sexual harassment occurring in your workplace. Where is it more likely to occur and what factors might make it more likely? And the guidance gives lots of examples of factors that might influence this, like power imbalances, work-related social events, obviously, particularly those involving alcohol, as well as things like office banter and online harassment on Teams or Zoom. And in practice, the risk assessment looks very similar to a health and safety risk assessment. So you set out the risks and then the measures that you're taking to minimize those risks. Second thing to think about is having a clear policy on sexual harassment. And the EHRC recommends having a standalone policy, or at the very least, distinguishing clearly between sexual harassment and other forms of harassment in your anti-harassment policy. And the policy also needs to be tailored to your organisation. So as well as setting out what sexual harassment is, you'd want to give some specific examples of where it might be likely in your organisation. There's also a lot of emphasis on ensuring your staff receive training. So ideally, you would have training on induction and then perhaps annual or periodic training after that. And those sessions should really explain what harassment is and what staff should do if they witness it or that they themselves are the victims of it. And your managers also need to receive training on what to do if they receive a complaint. And of course, how you deal with incidents is just as important. So the guidance talks about having an effective reporting mechanism and a culture that encourages reporting. In practice, that means providing training on speaking up and also having a few different channels for people to report, for example, through your whistleblowing policy or your grievance procedure. And then ideally having a separate confidential reporting line if possible. And the guidance also recommends that you keep a track or record of what complaints are made so you can identify trends over time. Then, of course, once the complaint is made, it needs to be investigated properly. And we'll come on to talk about investigations a little bit in a minute. But obviously, the worst thing you can do in the world is sweep the matter under the carpet. Sexual harassment allegations need to be properly dealt with and investigated. And finally, as part of the preventative duty, you have to think about third-party harassment. So the risk that your staff might be harassed by someone outside of the organisation, like a client or customer, or perhaps an investor or supplier. And you need to take measures to minimise those risks. Those measures are going to be different for different organisations and perhaps different sectors. So, for example, if you're an organisation in an industry like, say, retail or hospitality, it might mean putting up posters or signs to say that you don't tolerate harassment of your staff. But for other businesses, it might be that you want to put in place a code of conduct for suppliers and clients, or indeed have provisions in your contracts with them which set out the expectations. So any sorts of measures like that you can take to protect your staff from third-party harassment.
So Adam's been talking about third-party sexual harassment, which kind of leads quite neatly onto the next topic. And this is about a change which is going to come in the Employment Rights Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. And I'm sure you've read about this. It's going to be a new duty relating to third-party harassment more widely, so not just sexual harassment. So as Adam just explained, the duty to prevent sexual harassment includes a duty to take steps to prevent third-party sexual harassment. But where the Employment Rights Bill is going to go further is it will introduce specific employer liability for third-party harassment of any kind. So it's not limited to sexual harassment. It would cover harassment on any ground, so sex, race, age, sexual orientation, all of the protected characteristics. So what that would mean is that as an employer, you would be liable if one of your staff was harassed by a third party like a customer, client, supplier, unless you took reasonable steps to prevent it. Now, in terms of how that differs from what we have now, at the moment, you can be liable for that kind of harassment, but it's not that straightforward for an employee to get a claim off the ground. They can do, but there's quite a few hurdles to sort of jump. So this change will make it much easier for employees to bring a claim against you if they'd been harassed by someone outside the organisation and you didn't do enough to prevent it. So in terms of timing, we're likely to see this coming in 2026 because that's when most of the Employment Rights Bill changes are expected to take effect, which does give you some time to prepare. So what should you do to get ready? Well, the starting point was probably going to be a risk assessment. So looking at what interactions your employees have with third parties and what the risks are in different scenarios. That's going to vary quite a lot depending on what sector you're in. And in terms of what you can do to try to prevent it happening, you should be looking at your relationships with your suppliers and other third parties and what documents you have in place and whether they need updating. So, for example, do you need to put something in your third party contracts about harassment? Do you have some sort of supplier code of conduct which covers it? Or is it going to be enough to send them your policies and regular sort of reminders? And this is likely to be easier if your third party relationships are with other businesses. It's much more difficult if you've got a public facing business and you've got employees who deal with the public in their job, like hospitality or retailers Adam referred to earlier on. So things like putting up notices in the workplace or amending what you already have. I'm sure you've read there's been quite a bit of criticism about this new law, especially how it's going to work for public facing employees. Because of course you've got your customers having the right to free speech when they're socialising in a pub or whatever it is, and employees potentially feeling harassed by the remarks that they overhear when they're serving customers. So it does feel as though you've got a bit of a tension there, but I think, and we'll have to see, obviously, when we get all the detail, how this is going to shape up. But I guess a couple of points occur to us. One is that you have to take reasonable steps, and I'm sure that what's reasonable is going to depend on your sector and the kind of customers you have. So perhaps different things for, your pub customers as opposed to your sort of business customers. Also, hopefully we'll see some guidance on this once the bill comes in. So we should get some more detail on exactly the kind of things you will be expected to do.
Okay, moving on to another area under the banner of culture and harassment, and it's whistleblowing and investigations. As I said earlier, it's a big area of focus for employers at the moment. And in a sense, we've had whistleblowing laws in the UK for over 25 years. So it's not a new topic, but it has come under the spotlight recently, partly due to the Me Too movement, but also various other scandals that have been reported in the press involving whistleblowers who've been silenced or who've lost their jobs. So we've certainly seen an increase in scrutiny on employers and how they deal with whistleblowers and also how they deal with whistleblowing complaints. And that comes from all angles. So from regulators, certainly from the media, but also from investors and the wider public, as well as employees themselves. And the last few years have really seen a huge increase in whistleblowing claims in the Employment Tribunal. So last year, the FT reported that there'd been a 92% increase in whistleblowing claims over the period of just under 10 years from 2015 to 2023. And I can certainly say that within our team, we are seeing also a huge rise in whistleblowing claims that we're dealing with for clients. So what that means is it's incredibly important for employers to have effective whistleblowing policies and also clear channels for staff to raise concerns, and also to make sure that staff are aware of these. So again, through training and awareness programs. One trend we're actually seeing is a move away from the label whistleblowing to instead refer to speak up policies or speak up training, because it's got slightly more positive connotations and it sort of suggests what you're trying to get people to do is actually speak up. So we've been working with a lot of clients to create a culture where staff feel comfortable speaking up and raising concerns. And that's all about training and how your policies are framed. Now, a related issue, which again largely came out of the Me Too movement, is a focus on settlement agreements, which are used to resolve employment tribunal claims. Now, these typically contain confidentiality provisions, but they're sometimes referred to as gagging clauses because the criticism is that they're used to silence victims or prevent people from blowing the whistle. And it's now very common to spell out in a settlement agreement that any confidentiality provisions, and in fact, nothing in the agreement prevents the employee from blowing the whistle or going to the police or going to a regulator if they feel that's appropriate. And there's lots of regulatory guidance saying that you should do that. You should make it clear to employees that the confidentiality provisions don't prevent them from doing these sorts of things. It's also worth saying here that whistleblowing has become a bigger issue across Europe recently as well, with the EU whistleblowing directive now in place. It provides protection for whistleblowers and also includes requirements on some employers to have whistleblowing policies and channels for reporting concerns. In some ways, it's wider than UK whistleblowing laws, and it'll be interesting to see in future years whether our law is amended to bring it more in line with the EU directive. And then finally, just in terms of other possible future developments, something that's been floated, well, I guess for many years, but a lot recently, is using rewards or incentives to encourage people to blow the whistle. Now, they're very common in the US, where many regulators offer a financial incentive. Usually it's a percentage of any fine imposed for a successful whistleblower. But it's much less common in the UK. We've got some limited schemes operated by HMRC and the Competition and Markets Authority. But recently, the SFO, the Serious Fraud Office, has said it plans to introduce a reward scheme for people who report corporate crime. So it's definitely something we could see more of in the future.
So we wanted to turn now to look briefly at developments in relation to financial services firms. So apologies to those of you who are not in this sector at all. We won't spend too long on this, but for completeness, we thought we should cover it. So just a little bit of background on this first. So the FCA has for a long time now been really focused on workplace culture. So having what they call a healthy culture in which employees are not afraid to speak up, and on making sure that firms address non-financial misconduct. Then in 2023, the FCA published new draft rules on non-financial misconduct as part of a consultation paper on proposed new diversity and inclusion requirements in the financial services sector. Now, following that consultation, the FCA decided, perhaps a bit surprisingly, just to entirely drop the proposals on diversity and inclusion requirements. They have been criticised as placing quite a burden on businesses which are already heavily regulated. But the FCA did say they'll go ahead with the new rules on non-financial misconduct. So those rules are going to be incorporated into the FCA's existing conduct rules and will make it clear that non-financial misconduct will be expressly relevant for fitness and propriety assessments for certified staff, and also for regulatory references where you might need to end up mentioning non-financial misconduct. So the rules are in draft at the moment, and we're expecting the final rules published at some point next month in June, and then they'll probably come into force around a year after that. So in terms of what that will mean for you in practice, a lot of firms already will be taking non-financial misconduct into account in light of the FCA's focus in this area overall. And we need to see what the final rules will say, but we anticipate firms are going to probably want to update their compliance training and perhaps also compliance handbooks to highlight the relevance of non-financial misconduct and how that's treated. And at the same time, perhaps a good idea to review any reference policy or internal guidance and references that you might have to flag up that issue as well and how you deal with it.
Okay, moving on to our next key theme, which is diversity at work. I guess it's related to culture, but it's a particularly interesting theme to be talking about at the moment because I think we're in a real state of flux. There's obviously been a huge shift and a divergence recently between the approach to DEI in the US versus the approach here in the UK and Europe more broadly. So in the US, as I'm sure you've seen, there's been a clampdown on DEI initiatives that's particularly targeted at federal government agencies, but also affects the private sector. And you've probably seen the headlines, we've got some of them there on the slide, about employers rowing back from diversity initiatives, either by dropping them altogether or reframing them under a broader heading of inclusion or engagement or something like that, without a reference to diversity. But in the UK and Europe, the position couldn't be more different. So in the UK, we've got various government-backed diversity initiatives, and probably the most prominent of these is the gender pay gap reporting requirements, which have been in place since 2017. And they require businesses with 250 or more employees to report annually on the gender pay gap in their organisation. Now, in terms of Labour government changes, the Labour government plans to expand the reporting requirements to introduce mandatory disability and ethnicity pay gap reporting as well. And they also plan to require large employers to publish action plans, setting out what you're doing to address the pay gap in your organisation and also to support women going through the menopause. So those reporting obligations would all continue to apply to employers with 250 or more employees, and they're unlikely to come into force before 2026. The government's consulting about them at the moment. Across Europe, picture is very similar. So there's a new EU pay transparency directive, which comes into force in June next year. And that introduces gender pay gap reporting requirements across Europe for the first time, although some countries already have their own requirements. It also introduces a new requirement for joint pay assessments with employee representatives, where there's a pay gap of 5% or more, as well as other measures around transparency and pay in recruitment and in the workplace. And then there are also some new EU rules on gender diversity in boardrooms, which also come into force in June 2026. So while there's clearly been a rollback on DEI in the US, there continues to be an expansion of DEI initiatives really in the UK and Europe. On a related trend, with this sort of expansion of rights in the UK, we've seen a number of cases in recent years involving what we've called sort of a clash of rights. So where one person's rights interact or butt up against another's. So for example, one person's religion or beliefs clashes with the rights of other protected minorities and the protection against harassment. I've got a couple of case examples on this. So quite a few cases recently have centered around gender critical beliefs, i.e. belief that there are only two genders and that people cannot change their sex. And so the recent example here is the Higgs and Farmer's school case, where Ms. Higgs was a Christian, worked at a school, but she was dismissed after she put posts on Facebook criticizing teaching about same-sex marriage and also gender fluidity. And the Court of Appeal said the dismissal was discriminatory because it went too far. They essentially said that she had a right to express her beliefs and there was nothing inherently homophobic or transphobic about what she had put online, and there was no evidence her views impacted her work. There was another similar recent case involving a university professor with anti-Zionist beliefs, another very political topic at the moment. And his dismissal was also held to be discriminatory because it went too far in terms of how he'd expressed his views. But there's also a fairly recent case where a worker's belief in English nationalism was held not to be a protected characteristic or protected belief because it included anti-Muslim beliefs, and so conflicted with the rights of others. So there are limits to the beliefs which are protected here. But I guess what all these cases show is it's a very difficult area for employers to manage, particularly where you've got employees with very strong opposing views. But I guess employers have to be very careful not to take sides. We've seen various employers get into hot water by doing that, and certainly avoid knee-jerk reactions. I think you always need to look very carefully at exactly what's said and how it's said, and weigh an employee's right to freedom of expression against the offence caused to others. As a general rule, I think it's unlikely to be lawful to take action against someone just because of their views, even if they're potentially offensive views. But you might be able to take action where somebody has expressed their views in a much more forceful or offensive way. Anna's going to mention actually another case on clash of rights now.
Yeah, so this is a case which you will have seen, I'm sure. Oh, sorry, I had to get ahead of myself on the slides. Case which you would have seen, which wasn't an employment case, but it was the case in the Supreme Court on the meaning of sex in the Equality Act. So it's obviously big news that you'll have read about, but it was a case actually about gender balance on public sector boards in Scotland. And in that case, the Supreme Court had to consider what sex meant in the Equality Act. So was it biological sex only, or did it include sex on a gender recognition certificate? And the court decided it was biological sex only. So what that meant in terms of the Equality Act is that if a service provider is offering single-sex services, then it can limit access to biological sex only, and that doesn't amount to sex discrimination. Now, it wasn't an employment case, but it does have some implications for employers, kind of raises more questions that are answered at the moment. It's worth remembering the case did decide to a very narrow point on sex and sex discrimination. So there are quite a few, as said, unanswered questions, which hopefully we'll eventually get some guidance on. So a lot of employers will have offered access to facilities and potentially diversity groups and programmes based on gender, which might be wider than biological sex. Now, this case doesn't, as I said, it's a limited case in terms of what it looked at. It doesn't actively require employers to change these arrangements, but it clarifies that if they do limit access based on biological sex, then it doesn't amount to sex discrimination under the Equality Act. Now, after that court decision, the EHRC published an interim update on the practical implications, and it advises that employers should provide single-sex facilities available only to those of the same biological sex, and where possible provide mixed-sex facilities in addition to single-sex facilities. So that was some interim guidance from the EHRC. They are updating all of their relevant publications in light of the case, and we're expecting to see more detailed guidance from them in the next few weeks. But there are a few questions which are not fully addressed by the court decision or the EHRC update. So, for example, if you restrict access to single-sex facilities based on biological sex, then there could potentially, depending on the circumstances, be claims or complaints of discrimination or harassment on the grounds of gender reassignment from those who can't use the same facilities anymore. But on the flip side, if you were to allow access based on, if you were already allowing access based on self-identification and you carried on doing that, then there could be claims and complaints from individuals who feel strongly about the issue on religious or philosophical belief grounds or in relation to safe spaces for female employees. So that's just a sort of overview of potential legal claims that could come up either way. And also there are employee relations issues to consider aside from that as well. So you might have employees who are concerned about access to single-sex facilities, and they may now be asking for access based on biological sex only. You might have employees who have changed gender or in the process of doing so, who might feel anxious about potentially being excluded from facilities they were using before. And there is potentially an increased risk that transgender employees may be more likely to face harassment following that decision and the court decision and some of the debate that's been going on around it. So in terms of what to do now, there are lots of considerations really, and the best approach will depend on each individual employer, but a few different things to think about. So one of them was to be communications. So the reassurance you might give employees who could be worried about gender reassignment harassment, and equally to employees who may be concerned about safe spaces. Looking at your policies, seeing which policies address gender issues and whether you need to change or clarify them at all. checking that your policies clearly cover sex, religion and belief, and gender reassignment, discrimination and harassment, so that you're covering all the protected characteristics, and query whether you want to remind employees of those and the need to treat everyone with respect across the board. When it comes to facilities like toilets or changing rooms, looking at your current approach, whether you've had any issues in the past, who might be adversely affected by what you're doing currently, and what changes you might be thinking of making. And also gauging views of your staff. So if you've got diversity groups, talking to them, maybe thinking about carrying out a staff survey, you might have a staff forum you could talk to about the implications of the case. So lots of different things to consider, and every workplace is different. And I think the really difficult issue with this is the strength of feeling, obviously, on all sides of this debate, and that the balance for employers is trying to sort of navigate between those and strike the right balance between everybody's interests and concerns. As I mentioned, there is going to be some more detailed guidance coming from the EHRC. Lots of employers, I think, are waiting to see what that says before they make any changes. And we should hopefully see that by the end of June. We'll keep you updated on that in our employment update briefings and on our website as well.
Yeah, certainly a very tricky area to navigate. We're going to change track now and move on to something slightly different. So the expansion of worker rights. We've seen worker protections increase gradually over the last couple of decades, really, but they're set to expand quite significantly under the Labour government and the Employment Rights Bill. Now, there's a huge amount in the Employment Rights Bill in relation to worker rights. We're not going to go through all of it now, obviously, but we've picked out some key matters. Perhaps one of the most significant changes here is in relation to unfair dismissal. So, as you probably know, employees currently need at least 2 years service in most cases to bring an unfair dismissal claim. And that service requirement is going to be removed, so that unfair dismissal will become a day one right. So lots more employees will get the right to claim unfair dismissal than is currently the case. There will be a statutory probationary period during which a lighter touch process for dismissal will apply. We don't yet know how long that's going to be, but the government has suggested it would be 9 months. That seems to be their preference for now. And there still would be a requirement to follow some sort of process during that 9-month period, possibly involving a single meeting with the employee and giving them a right to be accompanied. And there might also be reduced compensation for unfair dismissal claims during that probationary period, but we need to wait to see the detail. Government said that the earliest this change will come into force is August next year, so there is a bit of time. But there are a few things you can be thinking about now. So one thing we'd suggest is to spend some time looking at your approach to probation. You might want to amend your contracts to include probationary periods if you don't have them already, or perhaps include longer periods. And you also might want to make sure you've got the power or the right to extend probation if you've got concerns. It would also be useful at some point to provide more guidance and training for managers on managing probation effectively, because in our experience, it's quite common for probation to slip past without anyone having had a real think or a serious conversation, and it would have been better perhaps in hindsight if the probationary period was extended. The other thing to flag here is the government's hinted about extending the right to unfair dismissal to all workers, and so not just employees. So this would be casual workers, gig economy workers, those sorts of categories of workers. And that would be quite a radical shift. That change is not in the Employment Rights Bill, but it is something that the government might consult on down the line. So something to watch out for.
So moving on now to look at restructuring and redundancies. So this is something which we are seeing a lot of employers either doing or planning to do or thinking about doing, given the current economic climate and the increase in employer NICs as well. So a lot of our clients thinking about the shape of their workforce and whether it's fit for the foreseeable future. Now, a restructuring will often involve changing terms. Ideally, you'd be doing this with your employee's agreement, but if they don't agree, then you can ultimately force the changes through if you have to by dismissing employees and offering them new terms, commonly known obviously as fire and rehire, and that has received a lot of negative media attention in recent years, which I'm sure you've seen. So following all of that bad press about fire and rehire, particularly post-COVID. The previous government introduced a statutory code of practice in 2024, so last summer, which suggests that employers should only use fire and rehire as a last resort after meaningfully consulting with employees or their representatives and considering all the alternatives. And if you don't follow the code of practice, you can face an uplift in compensation of up to 25% in a relevant claim. So if you don't consult properly over changes to terms and conditions and you use fire and rehire, an employee can bring a claim for a protective award, and that award can be uplifted by an extra 25%. So that's the current position. And it's probably not very different to what employees would do anyway in a fire and rehire scenario if they'd be well advised. If they'd be well advised, they'd be following what that code of practice says in any event. But with the Employment Rights Bill, that's going to go a lot further, and it's going to become extremely difficult to use fire and rehire, except in some very narrow situations. So the bill says it will be automatically unfair to dismiss someone for refusing a contract variation. So if you're trying to make changes to an employee's contract and they don't agree, and you serve notice and offer them a new contract, then it's an automatic unfair dismissal. So the actual wording around this is the dismissal will be automatically unfair if the principal reason is either that the employee refused to agree a contract variation, or that you were dismissing to re-engage them or recruit someone else in the same role on different terms. So that's a really significant change to the current position, where you can potentially defend an unfair dismissal claim in those circumstances if you've been through all the right process. There is a very limited exception in the Employment Rights Bill where the employer is in dire financial straits and fire and rehire is essential, but there needs to be a serious financial issue threatening your ability to run the business as a going concern, and you have to then not be able to reasonably avoid the change in terms. So it's really limited and a very high bar for the employer to establish that defence, much higher than anything you need now, where you just need a sort of business reason for needing to make the change. So in terms of timing, again, we're looking at 2026 as the likely timing of this change. So what can you do to prepare in advance? Well, a couple of things to say. One thing to do is to look at your contractor arrangements and see if any changes might be needed in the future and perhaps potentially bring them forward. So for example, a lot of employers will have, particularly employers that make a lot of acquisitions and so on, will have pockets of employees potentially on different terms, maybe some sort of legacy terms, historic terms, and you might be wanting to harmonise those. So maybe that's a project to be looking at sooner rather than later, given in light of these changes, if that's on your agenda. Another thing you can do is to have a look at your contracts and make sure there's as much flexibility in there as possible to change terms. So things like flexibility clauses in terms of making changes, mobility clauses, that sort of thing is going to be really important. So build in as much flexibility into your contracts as possible. So as I mentioned, a lot of employers are looking at these issues really as part of a wider sort of workforce planning exercise, which it's a good time to be doing.
And just on a related point, obviously sometimes it's necessary in restructuring to make redundancies. And so this is another area where there are some changes under the Employment Rights Bill. At the moment, there's a duty to consult collectively where you're proposing 20 or more redundancies at a particular site or establishment within a 90-day period. That threshold is going to remain under the Employment Rights Bill, but there will also be a new additional threshold based on the number of redundancies across the business. So that threshold hasn't yet been set out. It'll be set out in regulations, but it could be either a specific number of redundancies or a percentage of your workforce. But it will mean, unfortunately, that in practice, you need to count redundancies at each site if you're a multi-site employer, and also across sites across the business. Although the threshold will continue to apply per employing entity. So if you've got different employees in different group companies, you don't necessarily need to aggregate, it's just within the same company. The other change here is that the penalty is going to increase. So currently there's a protective award of up to 90 days pay per affected employee if you don't consult where you've got a duty to do so. And that's going to increase to 180 days pay per employee. There's no time frame on that yet. It's probably going to be in 2026, along with the other Employment Rights Bill changes. But I guess the upshot is the duty to consult is going to be triggered more often, and then the costs of getting it wrong are going to be higher. So a double whammy for employers.
I'm going to turn now to look at 0 hours in casual workers and try and rattle this quite quickly, because I'm conscious of the time. So as you know, the continuing rise of gig economy working often described as precarious work, has been the subject of a lot of debate, and there have been calls to improve the rights of workers in this position. And we've seen a new EU directive as well, enhancing these rights for 0 hours workers. Now, the Labour government did say before the election that they would ban 0 hours contracts, but actually they're not going that far. They're just giving more rights in the Employment Rights Bill to 0 hours and casual workers as well. So 0 hours workers will have the right to a permanent contract if their hours regularly exceed 0 over a 12-week reference period. So if that happens, the employer then has to offer a new contract reflecting the hours that they regularly work. That's not just 0 hours, it's also low hours workers. Again, if they regularly exceed their kind of minimum hours, then they have the right to be offered a new contract. We don't know what low hours means. That's going to be, well, many of these aspects will be subject to consultation, and that's going to be part of the consultation in due course, but it's an anti-avoidance, so you can't just offer a couple of hours a week or something like that to try to get out of it. Lots of questions about businesses with seasonal workers like retail, extra hours over Christmas, for example. How does that work then if you have a bumper hours for 12 weeks and then you get a new contract for those hours for the rest of the year? And that's something which I know is under discussion at the moment as the bill goes through the committee stage in the House of Lords. There's also going to be, for 0 hours and also any casual workers, anyone with irregular hours, they'll have a new right to reasonable notice of shifts and notice of cancellation and change to shifts. And if they have a sort of short notice cancellation or change, then they can get a compensation payment. Again, the detail of all this is going to be subject to consultation. But just to flag as well, these rights will also extend to agency workers. That's a more recent change made to the bill. The rules are, again, quite detailed, but there's different responsibilities on the end user and on the agency. Broadly, the end user has a responsibility of offering the hours, the agency the responsibility of paying compensation, but they might pay it back. So quite a lot of detail in there. And again, the timing of this is likely for 2026. So I guess in terms of preparation, if you do use 0 or low hours workers or casual workers, then I think it's just a question of really auditing how do you use them, what kind of hours do they do, how much notice they get of shifts, how does it work at the moment, and what's your potential exposure to compensation for sort of last minute cancellations and potential permanent contracts as well. Again, something which might form part of that kind of wider workforce planning exercise, which a lot of businesses are doing.
Okay, moving on to flexible working. There's clearly been a huge uptick in flexible working, hybrid working and remote working in recent years, and that's certainly a feature of the modern workplace, which is probably likely to stay. Both the previous Conservative government and the Labour government pledged at some point to make flexible working the default, but they've both stopped short of doing that so far. So last year, the Conservative government widened the scope of who's eligible to request flexible working by removing the service requirement. Previously, as an employee, you needed 6 months service before you could make a flexible working request. But as of April last year, the right to request is a day one right. They also increased the number of statutory requests an employee can make per year. So it's now 2 per year, up from 1. But Labour have proposed a further change that any rejection of a flexible working request would have to be reasonable. So this just adds an extra, I guess, hurdle for the employer to get over if the employer is refusing a flexible working request. Hard to see how much of an impact it's going to have because most employers would want to ensure any rejection is reasonable at the moment, given there's a risk of a potential sex discrimination claim. The other area here is hybrid and remote working, and that's certainly exploded since the pandemic. And again, probably here to stay at some level. But what we're seeing, I guess, is some employers requiring more office attendance, so trying to get people back to work more or perhaps full time. From an employment law perspective, I guess this comes down to what your employment contract says. So if you changed your contract to provide a right to home working or flexible remote working, then it may be that you need to amend those contracts. Lots of employers didn't do that. What they did is just put in a separate policy about hybrid working, and so you'd need to be updating your policy to make it clear what your expectations are going forward. The other trend is that we're seeing some companies link office attendance to bonuses or career progression, which is doable in principle, but you have to think about the discrimination risks there. Because if you penalise somebody because they've got childcare responsibilities who can't meet the requirements, or perhaps a disability, which means they need more remote working, then you could be into discrimination territory. And just to close the loop on the right to disconnect, which Jess mentioned earlier, this is something that the Labour government proposed to introduce. It's a right to switch off outside your working hours and not be regularly contacted and or have to respond to emails or calls. As Jess said, it already exists in a number of other countries like France and Belgium and Ireland. There are actually reports that the Labour government have dropped this, but that hasn't been confirmed by the government yet. So we'll have to wait and see. In any case, it was never intended to be particularly prescriptive. It was always going to be brought in by a code of practice, which would encourage employers to put in place their own policies. And in fact, we're already seeing employers putting in place their own policies around this anyway. Lots of you, for example, will be signed up to the Mindful Business Charter, which just encourages employers to think about more mindful ways of doing business and working, and ways that better support good mental health. So it's a trend that we're sort of seeing in any event.
Okay, so on the last topic, and then we can turn to your questions. I've seen a few coming up, which look like really interesting questions. So parents and carers is the last sort of topic we're going to look at. I'm sure you all know the new right to neonatal care leave and pay came into effect from the 6th of April this year. That gives new parents a right to up to 12 weeks statutory neonatal care leave and pay if they have a baby who goes into neonatal care for at least a week within 28 days of the birth. In terms of timing, that leave is usually taken straight after the end of maternity leave or shared parental leave or paternity leave, depending on which type of leave the parent's taking. So the rules are a bit knotty on this, but broadly, if the parent's already on leave when the baby goes into neonatal care, then they will take the neonatal care leave at a later date. If they're not on leave when the neonatal care leave starts, they can take the leave while the baby's in neonatal care. So the rules are quite complex, and there are some detailed notice requirements. It's something you need to check if it arises for any of your employees. It is a day one right, but employees only get the statutory pay at least 26 weeks service, and that's the statutory flat rate. It's currently £187.18 a week for up to 12 weeks. So some of our clients have been considering whether to enhance this. There's no right or wrong answer to that, and one approach to deal with it on a case-by-case basis, because it's likely to affect only a small number of employees. Of course, you can be more generous and make it fully paid if that's what you want to do. In terms of updating current policies, you can either introduce a standalone neonatal leave policy to set out the new right, or some employers are just flagging it up in the maternity and paternity policies instead. And just briefing on policies, you remember last year some changes were made to paternity leave, so it can be taken within a year of the child's birth or adoption and in 2 separate weeks, so it's now more flexible. If you haven't updated your handbooks recently, these may not reflect those changes. It's something you might want to check, and something we've been doing for quite a few clients lately as part of the annual handbook update. And then looking to the future, we're going to see some new family leave rights coming in as part of the Employment Rights Bill. So the most significant one is that it's going to be unlawful to dismiss someone during their pregnancy, during maternity leave, or for 6 months after their return, and the same will apply to adoption and shared parental leave. There will be exceptions. We don't know what they are yet, presumably misconduct, but it's not clear about other reasons like redundancy, for example. And we don't know how it will work in terms of will the dismissal be void and they carry on being employed or paid, which would be quite different to the way our law works usually, or will it be automatically unfair and they'll be able to claim compensation for loss? So either way, you'll want to make sure that you diarise dates and have a mechanism to make sure that any family leave is flagged up with this proposal to dismiss someone, so you don't inadvertently fall foul of this. Some other changes that are going to be made as well. Paternity leave and unpaid parental leave become day one rights. So the qualifying periods will be removed. At the moment, you need 26 weeks service for paternity leave and 1 year for unpaid parental leave. But given that paternity leave is only for 2 weeks maximum and parental leave is unpaid, I think this probably won't have a significant impact in practice in terms of sort of upheaval for employers. There's going to be a new right to bereavement leave, so at least a week of bereavement leave following the death of a family member. Currently, we only have parental bereavement leave for parents who lose a child. Originally, this bereavement leave wasn't going to cover pregnancy loss, but the government's confirmed that it will, and they're going to amend the Employment Rights Bill to reflect that. So when that all comes in, you'll be needing to update your policies. And looking much further ahead, the government plans to review the whole parental leave system. And there's some indication they might even start this as soon as next month, so June this year. There was a similar consultation in 2019 by the previous government, which looked at things like pots of leave for each parent, but then actually none of that was taken forward. It's something we may see come back onto the table to try to make the system more balanced because such low take up of shared parental leave. And finally, the other thing the government said it would look at is carers leave, which is fairly new. We only got it last year. It's unpaid at the moment. The government will look at it overall and may look at whether it should be paid as well. So we may see that becoming a paid right.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Adam and Anna, and I hope that I've seen some questions come through, and I'm mindful of time. We've got 5 minutes left, so if you do need to drop off, then yes, there will be a recording of this available from next week. And Adam, Anna, will we get the copy of this PowerPoint as well, if possible, please?
Yeah, we can absolutely
Yeah.
share this.
Okay. Perfect. So if anyone does need to drop off, we've got 30 host consultants from Scotland down to Cornwall. Your local person, your local HR specialist will be in contact, provide you the PowerPoint and the recording of this session as well. So we'll get onto the questions from here. So starting with the first one, so we're going back to the sexual harassment policies. So is asking employees to review the sexual harassment policy document enough to say that your employees have received training on this?
I think probably not,
Yeah.
actually. I think maybe historically that would be okay, but I think what this is really driving at is employers taking more proactive steps. So I think asking employees to read it, particularly because you know that not everyone will do it, even if you get them to countersign. I think probably it's not mandatory, but I think it's virtually mandatory that you have some sort of in-person or virtual training with staff.
Yeah, so it's documented every year, a bit like anything like tax evasion that people do on a yearly basis.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then coming on to the next one is that how will preventing sexual harassment law impact freelancers and contract workers?
Yeah, the third party point, isn't it, really? It's about preventing. So as far as the law is concerned, those will be sort of third parties coming in to work for you. So you'll need to just make sure that your own staff are protected from the kind of behaviour of those freelancers and contract workers, which kind of, on the one hand, you've got a bit of a tension there because you don't want to be exercising too much control over your freelancers and contractors. You know, you want to keep them at arm's length, but on the other hand, you need to make sure that you take reasonable steps to prevent them from harassing your own staff. So you will be wanting to ask them to comply with your policies and procedures, query whether you have some sort of separate kind of light touch training for them as well.
Yeah.
And just to expand on that then is let's think about agency workers in an organisation. Will then the liability fall on, for example, a Hayes, and then more of the policies and agreements need to be looked from a third party contractor view in that kind of aspect between suppliers?
I think the way to think about it is probably a bit like health and safety, actually. So, you know, your agency workers come in, they need to have health and safety training. You know, they need to be trained in certain aspects, policies of the way you do your business. I think sexual harassment is part of that because as an employer, if an agency worker comes in and harasses one of your staff, you can be liable for it. So I think it definitely makes sense to be setting expectations with agency workers.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And then we've got can contract variation clauses really help given the very limited ability to use and dismiss re-engage going forward?
That's a very fair point.
It's fair
I
point.
completely
They're
agree.
not a silver bullet by any means, are they?
Yeah. I think it's about having things that are helpful that you can point to in a consultation with employees, rather than saying, yes, legally this could just be absolute right to change your contract.
Yeah. I mean, you often see, I mean, you know, you always will have in your contract, you want to have in your contract something saying, we can make changes just by notifying you, and if you don't object, then it means you've accepted them. But just contract law doesn't work quite as clearly as that. You know, if it's an obvious change that's having a day-to-day effect on their sort of normal day-to-day working life and they don't object, then they can be taken to have agreed it. But if it's something like giving them a restricted covenant or changing their notice period, which doesn't affect them until they actually leave, then they could say, well, I never agreed to that. I mean, you certainly would want them in there, as Adam says, something to point to, but they're definitely not the sort of a silver bullet by any means.
Okay. And following that, is there any indication of a revised or new ACAS code of policy for probation periods?
I haven't heard anything about a revised ACAS code of conduct, code of practice on probation period, but I imagine that there will be some guidance in some form, and I'm sure ACAS will produce guidance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got two questions about hybrid working and the return to office, which many of us are experiencing or speaking about with friends, family, and colleagues. So if hybrid working has taken place for some time, could an employee argue that it's become implied into the contract of employment, if not written down anywhere?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it will depend on what your policy says and how it's been communicated. Because if you've been very clear that you know, this is a temporary arrangement, or it could change at any time, then it would be very difficult, I think, for an employee to say that that has become a contractual right through custom and practice. But if you haven't said much about it and you just let people do it, then I think perhaps the risk is a bit greater.
Yeah, I think that leads us and semi-answers the following question, is that if people have managed to fly under the radar and go against policies and work from home more than contract or policy say for many years, hasn't it just become common practice regardless what's in the contract?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think you're right. I mean, the less helpful communication there has been about it, the greater the risk that the person could say, yeah, this is a right through custom and practice. I mean, it is not necessarily a low bar for the employee to get over to say something has become a contractual right through custom and practice. So I don't think by all means it's you know, certain that they would succeed in that argument, but yeah, there is a greater risk.
A lot will depend on the communications you have, because I think that the way the cases work is that you're doing something because you think you have a legal right to. So if someone's just flying under the radar and kind of just lying low and doing it, that's maybe a bit harder for them to say customer practice. Whereas if they've had lots of emails and communications with their managers, which kind of suggest that everyone's working on the basis of this is a kind of permanent agreed arrangement, then that's a higher chance that they'll be able to argue it.
I think that from a HR perspective, what I'm speaking to my networking, that's more of a behavior piece. So are the HR business partners upskilled and skilled enough to be having those high level conversations with managers, whether it comes to performance reviews or even the tougher conversations that we need to have. And then the final question that we've got so far is regarding restructures. So question is, you mentioned that you need to consider redundancies on different sites, but not necessarily different entities. What if there's a sister branch in the UK entity, but a different jurisdiction? Do you need to consider them?
Good question. So I think the rules will only apply to employees working in Great Britain. So if you've got let's just say, for example, you're one company, you've got some employees working at different sites in the UK and then some employees working at sites abroad, you're only going to have to count, I think. I mean, we don't know yet, to be honest, is the real answer. I think you're only going to have to count redundancies in the UK. It becomes slightly tricky, I guess, if the threshold becomes a percentage of your workforce. Are you just talking about the UK workforce or the entire workforce of that entity? But certainly, if you've got employees in different entities, then you don't have to aggregate across those different entities. You treat them separately.
Okay, lovely. And I think we have one more. Back to flexible working, is that with more flexible working, where many employees wish to do a 4-day week, usually Monday to Thursday, can a manager tell them that someone in the team that they cannot have a Friday as annual leave because there would be no cover?
That's an interesting question.
Really interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess annual leave is always, usually you'll have it in the contract that it will be sort of manager approval. So I guess there's no reason why you can't do that as you would with any day where you would say we don't have enough cover for that particular day that you want to take. I think it's with any reason why you wouldn't be able to do it. But yes, that's an interesting question in terms of the sort of difficulty that it might cause for other people. I think that's the problem with flexible working is it's a bit first come, first served. So, people who are already doing something there can have a detrimental effect on somebody else who comes into it later.
Yeah. Okay. And this one last question is actually from myself. The EU pay transparency, obviously that impacts companies in the UK if they've got EU entities over a certain level. Does that policy also impact in EU gender balance on boards as well? Or does that only span across the pay transparency directive?
So the gender balance on boards is only listed EU companies.
Okay.
Yeah, so it wouldn't. Yeah, it's a really good question because the pay transparency directive would affect a UK employer if you've got people working overseas. But if you're a UK entity, then the gender board diversity directive won't affect you.
Okay. Lovely. So I think that's the end of our questions. And therefore,
There's one more. I don't know if you've got time. There's one more
is
about
there?
how you contract and offer letter. I don't know if that's.
That is following on from the previous. So if contract says hybrid working, but the offer letter says 2 days, and a company wants to increase that, do they need to consult like they would change in terms, although there is a not contractual written agreement?
I think it will depend. I think that will depend very much on how it's worded. So ideally, your contract would just say something like, we have a hybrid working policy, or something like that, or the offer letter would say that, and an indication of what you'd want, and then you can make it clear that it might need to change in the future. So it really will depend on how it's worded, but you'll want to word that with as much flexibility as possible in terms of stating it as your policy rather than anything higher than that.
Agree.
Yeah. Lovely. Okay. Well, thank you again, both to you both, Adam and Anna. It's been really great to have you, and I've got heaps of notes, very informative. So thank you. And to all of our attendees, thank you very much for coming. As many of you know, is that we host these kind of live webinars with a mixture of subjects nearly every quarter, so every 3 months. We already do have our next one booked in. It's all around AI and talent, and it's coming from more of a legal potential risks perspective when it comes to this. So that's Wednesday via Zoom, Wednesday, the 11th of June at the same time. And then just to finish it off, following from your conversation, a lot of employees are looking at workforce planning. I read on City AM today that is looking at 1 in 4 companies are looking at their structures at the moment. So any of our attendees that would like to speak about whether it be recruitment or what we're seeing in the market or a general pulse on what the labour market looks like, then do give us a call. Like I said, 30 HR specialist consultants in the UK, and someone will be in contact to discuss your strategic plans, but then also follow up on today's event.